In this video, you will learn about the basics of a lease, what is involved with renting a property, and how to deal with a landlord or property manager. A tenant is someone who pays rent to live in a property, such as a house, an apartment, a condominium, or townhouse that is owned by someone else. A landlord is the owner of the property that is rented by the tenant to live in. A property manager is someone the landlord may hire to manage the property that the landlord is renting. A lease is a written agreement between the tenant and landlord, allowing the tenant to live in the property in exchange for rent. The lease says what the tenant and landlord are responsible for, and both must do what the lease says. Before signing a lease, it is best to have someone you trust or an attorney assist you in understanding the lease. Rent is the amount of money the tenant pays the landlord or property manager each month. It is paid in advance, usually on the first of the month for the current month, unless otherwise stated in the lease. Know where and how to pay the rent. Is it paid online, by check, or with cash? Always get a receipt. The lease term is the time period the tenant and landlord agree that the tenant can live in the property and for how long the tenant will pay rent. Usually the term is for 1 year, but it can be less or more if both you and the landlord agree. When the initial term is over, you and the landlord can sign a new lease or you can leave the property. The landlord is mainly responsible for making sure the property is fit to live in and that basic things work. The landlord is usually responsible for larger repairs like the furnace, hot water heater, stove, refrigerator, and dishwasher. Know what repairs the landlord is responsible for before you sign the lease. Confirm the lease has either the landlord's or property manager's contact information, like the telephone number and email address, and how to contact them in an emergency. The tenant must pay rent and keep the property in good condition. Other responsibilities will be listed in your lease, such as paying for damages that you or your guests cause or making minor household repairs. Know what repairs you're responsible for before you sign the lease. A security deposit is money that the tenant gives the landlord to hold in case the tenant fails to pay rent or damages the property. The security deposit is your money. If you do everything that the lease says you must do, then you should get your security deposit back at the end of the lease. This must happen within 30 days after the lease has ended, or 60 days if that's what the lease says, but never more than 60 days after the lease has ended. If the landlord does not return all of the security deposit, they must provide the tenant a written statement that shows any deductions made from the security deposit and why the money was deducted. If you disagree with the deductions, you can go to small claims court and have the judge decide. You can get more information about small claims court from the county in which you live. Generally, the tenant pays the first month's rent plus the security deposit, which is usually equal to 1 month's rent, but sometimes it can be more. Also, if you are moving in during the middle of a month, you may be required to pay additional rent for the part of the month you will be living in the property. Rent may not be all you have to pay. Usually, most utilities like electricity, natural gas, water, internet, and cable TV are paid by you. Everything that you are responsible to pay for will be listed in the lease. Likewise, everything the landlord is responsible to pay for will be listed in the lease. Be familiar with everything that you are required to pay before you sign the lease. Many items in the lease are negotiable and can be changed if the tenant and landlord agree. The two most common things that people try to negotiate are the lease term and the rent amount. Always try to communicate with your landlord or property manager in writing when possible, by letter or email. You can also call them by phone, but try to follow up with an email to confirm what was said. If it is an important matter, you should send a letter by certified mail. In an emergency, call the emergency number that should be in your lease. If that number is not in your lease, ask for it before you move in. The landlord or property manager may want to check on the property's condition, but they cannot just come over whenever they want unless there is an emergency. They must give you reasonable notice or get your permission, and it must be at a reasonable time. Review your lease concerning this notice and the landlord's right to enter the property. Once you rent the property, it is your home for the term of the lease, and you have a right to privacy. A late fee can be charged only if your rent payment is late by 7 or more days, and the late fee is stated in your lease. You must receive notice of the late fee within 180 days of the date on which your rent payment was due. Late fees are limited to the greater of $50 or 5% of the past due rent payment. An eviction is a legal process that a landlord must go through to remove a tenant from the property. This process is typically used when a tenant violates one or more lease terms, such as failing to pay rent, not leaving the property after the lease term ends, allowing people who are not on the lease to stay on the property, or conducting illegal activity on the property. We recommend you view the Renting, Leasing Basics Guide available on the Colorado Division of Real Estate's website, which includes resources such as rental assistance, legal questions, and filing a complaint against a property manager. Thank you for taking the time to learn about leases and renting a property.